I think you're really an optimist. You said we've reached the sort of the crowning point of this, like, oh, no, it's going to get much worse. I don't think we save whatever democracy we had. But no fascist moment has lasted forever.
That's Jeff Sharlet, a journalist who's written about American religious movements for years. In this episode of In Solidarity, we asked Jeff a pretty fundamental question. Is Trumpism a political movement, or is it more useful to think of it as a mystical offshoot of American Christianity? My sense from covering similar movements around the world is that politics is the wrong frame to analyze the Trump phenomenon. What if we covered Trumpism not as politics, but as religion? And the reason I wanted to talk to Jeff about it is because in 2023, he wrote perhaps the most perceptive book about the Trump era, The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hi, Aman. Good to be with you.
Let's just get straight to it. Tell me why you felt you needed to write this book.
So as you say, I've been writing about religious movements for a long time, and I began interested just as a writer in how do I get beyond the stack of facts? And if you're writing about people's religion, which includes but is not limited to beliefs, right? You're necessarily engaging with the intersection of the material and the intangible for them. And so it draws you into kind of a deeper relationship with your subjects. I backed sort of backwards into the political aspect of it, writing about kind of pretty powerful American network called the Fellowship or the Family, drawn by the sort of strangeness of their experience, but they work in politics. So suddenly I'm writing about politics. And when Trumpism came along, it was because I'd been working with them and seeing how they understood their religious calling, which is they're a very international organization of various members of Congress and, big business guys are involved and so on. And they see this idea of cultivating strong men around the world. They really see that as a theological point, that this is the kind of leader God wants. They had never quite gone that far in the United States until Trump rides down that golden escalator in 2015. So I remember going around to the various magazine editors that I worked with. And because I wasn't right on the politics beat in that sense, I'd done political writing, but it wasn't my main beat. I said, let me write about Trump. I recognize this guy. All 2015, people are like, oh, no. Trump is funny.
Donald Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke.
We're going to send a funny writer, Jeff. You're not funny. We're going to send a funny writer to write about Trump. And I'm like, no. I don't know that he's going to win, but I know that he could because we understand the power of that move, right? And it wasn't until March or April 2016, an editor named Bill Wasik, who's now at the New York Times Magazine, called and said, would you write something about a Trump rally as a religious event? And he said, well, there's something in Youngstown tomorrow. And I raced to the airport, Youngstown, Ohio, which is this old steel town down on its luck. And I don't go as press. I never go as press. So I just stood in line like everybody else for 6 hours and then stood in the concrete hangar of an airport, squashed in amongst people, listening to them talk with ecstasy about the coming of Trump, waiting through the opening speaker, who, even though having been to fundamentalist churches of variety over the years, I'd never heard anything so militant. I've been to some right-wing churches, and this was something else. And the crowd loving it, even though as I would talk to them, most of them were not churchgoers. And you've probably seen this, a lot of people who like religious authoritarian movements, it doesn't mean that they're pious. And then looking back at the press pen, because at a Trump rally, he puts you in a metal pen in the middle of the arena. And there's a point in every rally where he says, look at those scum. And everyone turns around and, says, fuck you.
These thieves and crooks, the media, not all of it, but much of it.
And I look back at the press while this preacher's going on, they're looking at their phones. Because the story is Trump is not religious. Obviously, the evangelicals weren't going to vote for him. He's not a pious man. But I do actually think in his way, he is a religious man who has a sense of divinity in relationship to himself. Not something you'd find in a church, but a driving force that makes him more potent than the standard demagogue who is just kind of invoking it.
Let's actually go there. In your book, you talk about the idea that his believers see Trump as the imperfect vessel, right? And you actually, in your book, kind of trace that back to a strain of biblical knowledge. But if you could fill that in for us, where you talk about this idea that God summoning an imperfect vessel is something that people are quite ready to kind of latch on to.
God lifted me up. That's as old a story as there's, and that's not just an old tent revival story in America. That's King David. That's King David in the Bible. He's fighting a war, and his best general is off at the front, risking his life for David. And David's hanging out one day, and he's sort of on top of a building. He looks over into the courtyard, and he sees the general's wife, Bathsheba, and she's taking a bath. And he's like, I think I'd like her. You can definitely read scripture as saying he rapes her, but that's not enough. He wants the general, his friend, his loyal ally out of the way, so he arranges for him to be killed. And God still chose him. Talk about an imperfect vessel. A congressman named Mark Sanford, who had been a presidential prospect, got caught in all kinds of affairs and so on. And he invokes exactly that teaching, the King David teaching. And you see it again and again and again in the secular religious divide, the idea of I was a sinner, but God is using me. And that made Trump a really good vessel.
Let's come back to this idea of the Trump rally. At some point, Trump starts talking about the fact that he does this thing called the weave.
So with Afghanistan, I do the weave. You know what the weave is? I'll talk about like 9 different things and they all come back brilliantly together. And it's like, and friends of mine that are like English professors, they say, it's the most brilliant thing I've ever seen. But the fake news, you know what they say? He rambled. That's not rambling.
And I then started actually watching Trump rallies on YouTube, and I realized that they do have an internal coherence of their own. There is a lot of non sequiturs. But again, that's something I've seen in authoritarian rallies that are in India, for example, where you wonder why people are still listening while this has gone on for a long, long time. But there does seem to be a way that in your writing, you seem to be the only one who actually, the only journalist who actually listens to everything that is said in the course of a speech. And then you actually analyze it almost as not political speech, but again, a sermon. Like, what was that experience like for you to be like, I'm going to kind of just literally start listening to exactly what is said in these rallies and start reading them? Like, how did that kind of, I know it sounds like a really strange question to be like, at what point in this event did you start paying attention? But
no, it is. At what point did you start doing basic journalism, which is you're going to think, what do they actually say, right? But then you come to the weave, right? And you've watched, and I admire you for doing that, because I've met a lot of people who write about the politics of Trump who have never watched a whole speech. When you do, you solve that mystery of why do people care? And I'm going to say this, and folks get mad at me. He's the second best orator, or one of the, I'm not putting him second best, one of the 2 best orators. Obama's very good, very different. Trump isn't doing that. You're like, what? Trump's not like that. No. In fact, part of what makes him good is he's his own thing. And the weave is real. And he's very good at it. And the non sequiturs, as you know, are also demonstrations of power, right? I can talk about anything in the same way that when Trump sort of wobbled on stage for 45 minutes and during the campaign, just listening to music, everyone laughed. No, it was a demonstration of power, and it's persuasive. It's a little bit, if you go to a church and you'll see a faith healer, and they will sometimes stand in silence for a long time, receiving God, and you're feeling it. And he doesn't get it right all the time either. And I think that's what it's a little bit of like, okay, I'm going to go for this. And when it works, it's like improv comedy. And I don't mean that in a light way. It's like, I can't believe they didn't even have a plan. And this story came together so beautifully. And we could get into, Trump and the sharks or Trump and the windmills. And when you start revisiting all those stories that people like to make fun of, you start seeing how the believers are experiencing them. And they may be wrong. And I think they're fascists, but they are not fools. Something is being conveyed there.
My name's Sian Norris, and I'm a senior investigative reporter at openDemocracy. My work investigating military sexual abuse, telling the stories of those at the sharp end of government anti-migrant policies, exploring prison data, and reporting on the dark money powering anti-abortion interests is only made possible thanks to your support. Please donate to support Open Democracy today. Simply visit opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you.
And I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about primarily the people, right? Simply because of the fact that we've seen so much writing on Trump the person, Trump the person, Trump the person, Trump the person, but very little kind of writing beyond the fact that there were crowds, these people came, but there's nothing that actually kind of goes deep under the skin of Trump support, as it were. And I'm not sure where you wrote this, whether this was the Undertow, but somewhere in your writings, I hear you, or I read you rather, quoting Joan Didion, right, of trying to read the stories we tell ourselves in order to live. And if we were to take that formulation to the Trump voter or to the people you met in the rallies, what is the story, and on all the reporting you did when you spoke to these people, what are the stories they're telling themselves in order to live?
Well, yeah, so that Joan Didion line is the first line of her great book, The White Album. And at least in the United States, you can get it on a tote bag or on a mug. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. And people say, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that beautiful? We're the storytelling animal. They don't pay attention to the rest of the paragraph in which she speaks, for instance, in another less famous, but just as eloquent phrase, the sermon and the suicide. The stories we tell ourselves in order to live are not necessarily true or good. In fact, quite often they're just the opposite of that, right? And they're varied. And I think the endless debate 9 years in, is Trump racism or the economy? As if the answer could ever be anything but yes, and. You know, I think of a man I met in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And as I travel around the country, you know, a lot of people fly Trump flags, fuck Joe Biden flags with AR-15 that says come and take it. Sometimes the Blue Lives Matter flag, created, as the creator told me, as an anti-Black Lives Matter flag, and the all-black flag, which is an American flag, but just in sort of shades of black, which stands for no mercy in a coming civil war in which they believe take no prisoners, kill everybody. Well, when someone flies a flag like that, it's on the one hand scary. On the other hand, I always think it's a little bit like in grade school, someone writes the name of their favorite band on their notebook. It's because they want you to see that. Oh, you like that band too. So I stop and I knock on the door, and I have the advantage of being a middle-aged, bald white man. And I say this, one bald man to another, I really believe the baldness helps with certain assumptions.
I'm glad there is some advantage to baldness. As a newly bald person, I feel validated.
Yes. But so I have an advantage, but there's also just the fact you're flying a flag. It's like, ask me. And so this guy had a whole pole of Trump flags. And so I asked him, and this was right after the downfall of Roe v. Wade, which was the right to abortion in America, which had long been believed invulnerable, and Trump had promised to break it, and now it was broken. And I asked, why you find that flag? And this is 2022. And he says, it's like, because the Democrats took away abortion. So on the first read is, what a fool, right? And that's correct. That first read is correct. And we start talking to this guy, and he's no deep thinker. And he's a white guy, and there's a racism that pervades some of what he says, although it's not explicit. And he doesn't understand himself as motivated by that. He does understand himself motivated by medical suffering. He is not getting the medical care he needs. He sees people not getting the medical care they need, right? He understands that this system isn't working. And yes, a guy has come along and says, I'm going to wreck it and fix it. And he's believed it. And we can stop there as a fool and then dismiss him. Or we can say, oh, that's an interesting thing. And then move on to the next person. I have met people who love Trump because of explicit white supremacism. Even weirder, I have met people who are not white who love Trump because of explicit white supremacism. I went to a rally in Sunrise, Florida, and I knew there would be a lot of Cuban Americans who tend to be quite conservative there. What I was not prepared for were all the Venezuelan and Nicaraguan flags. Nicaraguan Americans and Venezuelan Americans who see in Trump as their champion. And talking to the Venezuelans, some of them it was because they hope Trump will invade Venezuela, which I don't think is on the agenda. But again, is this very different than the man who says the Democrats are the ones who ended abortion?
What is the promise of Trump, right, when you're a person of color? And when one thinks about authoritarian movements, and you're like, the whole purpose of this movement is to essentially otherize and alienate these communities. So why are you here? And the idea seems to be some sense of wanting I'm looking for the right word here, but the sort of impunity of action. wanting a piece of that. Is that something that came up in your conversations with the attendees when you would be like, what brings you here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think of the longest section of the book, the Undertow, is about, well, it's not about, but it's sort of following the ghost of this woman named Ashley Babbitt, who on January 6th, Democrat all her life, two-time Obama voter. Obama remained her second favorite president after Trump. And she went on January 6th to storm the Capitol. And you may have seen images, I think they went around the world. She was wearing a Trump flag as a cape and climbing through a broken window behind which congressmen were huddling. And a police officer shot her and killed her. And she became a martyr for the movement. And so I decided to sort of, I could see the martyr cult forming. And I'm like, I'm just going to follow this. I'm going to wander the country and watch this ghost kind of rise from the dead. And I started in Sacramento, California, where there was a rally being held, an Ashley Babbitt rally. And everything was stark because it was on the same day as what would have been the birthday of a woman named Breonna Taylor, a young Black woman killed by police in Kentucky when they burst into her apartment wrongfully and just started opening fire. Also a martyr in a different sort of way. So on one side of the Sacramento, which is the capital of California, one side of the State House is a Breonna Taylor rally, and the other side is an Ashley Babbitt rally. And the Ashley Babbitt rally, she's a white woman. More of the speakers than not were people of color, Latino and Black. Small crowd, maybe, probably close to 50-50 Latino, white, with a much smaller number, but presence of Black folks. I spoke to one young Black man named Julius. He was wearing a T-shirt of a group called the Saviors, which is the Statue of Liberty, but white and sort of bleeding red. And it's actually, these were Proud Boys, but they had gone undercover. They didn't want anyone to know they were Proud Boys. So they had made another uniform and another group called the Saviors. Their disguises weren't great. And Julius wasn't one of them, but he liked the T-shirt and had it. And a young Black guy who goes around to right-wing rallies and does live streams, and he's into them. And he's into them because he said, leftists are always going on about slavery. I don't want to talk about slavery. He saw this as his liberation. Just what you said, that promise of impunity. And the Black Lives Matter protests, the Breonna Taylor protesters come around and they're chanting Black Lives Matter. And Ashley Babbitt's mother, a grieving mother, her daughter has been killed, crying. She suddenly pivots in her speech, and in response to Black Lives Matter and that chant, she starts chanting Ashley Babbitt. One white woman versus Black lives. And it becomes this contest. And I'm looking around at the Latino folks and the Black folks, and they're chanting Ashley Babbitt.
The question that our readers ask us, that people who listen to this podcast ask us, that often shows up in comments, is where does one actually go from here? In one thing that I want to think about, before you answer, I want to talk about a piece of yours that, as you can see, I'm quite a Sharlet completist. A piece of yours that I read maybe 2015-ish. It's about like a men's rights rally, right? And this is like sort of writing on the manosphere, which now is just, everyone knows what the manosphere is. But at that point was just like, hey, there's this thing called the manosphere. What is this? Who are these people? Like early incel culture. And we now see Elon Musk X Trumpism. Like this seems to be the crowning moment of a lot of subcultures of American life kind of coalescing, right, under one sort of umbrella. And when one thinks about winning people away from these coalitions, and I think it also speaks to this larger question of, when you show up at a rally, are you a person of color first, or are you a member of the manosphere? What is your primary identity, right? And I think that's one of the things that emerges when I read your work, which is you're talking to people struggling to decide what their primary identity is.
I think you're really an optimist. You said we've reached the sort of the crowning point of this, like, oh no, it's going to get much worse. For instance, Elon Musk just rounded the bend. I mean, we could say, I always knew he was a Nazi, except that he wasn't. He was always maybe a creep. And I think this is a terrible mistake amongst those who care about democracy, is to see the enemies and the villains and so on and see them as flat characters without development. To say that was part of why we lost to Trump again. So many people saying, I know what Trump is. Like, no, you knew what Trump in 2016, and that was very bad is. Trump in 2024, he's moved. And it's much, much more dangerous. And there was journalists along on the beat trying to tell them that, no, I don't need to hear anymore. I already know what it is. The only thing I need to know about a Nazi is where his nose is so I can punch it, right? And like, no, actually, you do need to know more. Anyone who has lived with threat where they can't resolve it right away, you know? I'm a Jewish guy. I do have a Nazi living down the road. And by a Nazi, I mean a man with swastikas tattooed over himself, who has guns, who knows I'm a Jew, who says I'm half white though, so it's okay because I'm a half Jew. You know, I like to know what Ralph is thinking. I need to know how armed Ralph is. I know Ralph has friends in the state police. I need to know how many friends he has, because I can't just say go away, right? It's going to get worse. Where do we go now? I think we go through a fascist moment. I think it gets worse. I don't think we save whatever democracy we had. But no fascist moment has lasted forever. It's not the end of history. It's not this Francis Fukuyama thing, right? So how do you start working and building those subcultures to get you through? And as you say, bringing some of those people back. I'm very sympathetic, say, to a trans person who says, it's not my fucking job to do this. There's an assumption so often amongst liberal and the left, if these guys just heard the right message, they just haven't been told. You know as well as I think, you spend time, it's not that they haven't heard these arguments, they reject them. The pleasure is in rejecting it, right? It's not like, if only someone had told me women were human, I would not have been such a misogynist jerk. No, they know this, right? So you use your discernment to see the ones who are drawn by pleasure and to see the ones who are drawn by other griefs. And then to pay attention to those other grievances, right? To say, okay, this is what you think over here. But just like the fool who flies a Trump flag because he thinks the Democrats are taking away his health care, that man is talking about his body. He's talking about it hurts to be him. Let's talk to him about what hurts, right? I'm not a policy guy. I'm not going to pivot in this conversation and say, now let me lay out my plan. That's not my part, right? Because there's other people whose courage is called in that direction. And that takes courage too, right? That's how I think we get through it, at least in the United States, and in the global fascist moment, which is, of course, converging.
Thank you for listening to In Solidarity, the Open Democracy podcast about people, power, and politics. In Solidarity is produced by James Battershill, Ayodeji Rotinwa, and Nandini Archer. Audio clips were taken from CSPAN. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abela. Thank you again for listening to In Solidarity.